Well, friends, it's Ash Wednesday, and today we start Lent. And it's the first time we're going to have an entire Lent season in a pandemic, at least in my lifetime. And it's very, very hard. Let's just name this, right? We are relationally separated. Our experience of corporate worship is mediated by screens, and it's been a hard year. We are wired, you and I, we're wired for relationship. We're wired to be the kind of people that when the world looks at us, we have these relational dynamics starting to come together as God intended in the first place. This relationship to God and ourselves, this relationship to ourselves and other people, our relationship to even the creation, and of course, our relationship to ourselves. Most of those dynamics in some way, shape, or form have been broken, alienated by force in a way that we never could have anticipated. It's one of those situations where, yes, we are following guidelines and we're being wise and we're trying to steward the science that we understand well. And so we're not gathering formally, at least in large gathering spaces. But here's the thing. In the midst of all of that, some of you are experiencing loneliness. Some of you have been depressed at times. Some of you have been in the state where you're wondering if today is going to get any better or if it's going to just kind of always cycle and just sort of the same old. Man, I'm tired of the same old. I know you are too. It's even possible that some of you know people who have been infected with COVID, who have possibly died. I know we have a family friend of a friend who passed away from COVID. So these are real realities. And yet here we are in the season of Lent. And Lent in the Christian story is really a retelling of Jesus' time in the desert. It's that space that we're invited to go to each year with Jesus to experience the darkness, to experience the painful parts, to notice within ourselves and in our community that we have blind spots and shadows and things that need to really be confronted by the overwhelming goodness and love of God. And so, does that work now? You know what I mean? Like, we're in the middle of a pandemic and it almost feels like we've been forced into a almost year-long fast from relationships, from all kinds of things that we've come to know as normative and life-giving. Now, it hasn't all been bad, but if we're really just confronting a pandemic during Lent kind of situation, I'll tell you my first instinct is don't give up anything for Lent. At least that's what I'm telling myself. Right? Like, why would I give up anything for Lent when the whole context that I have found myself in, that you have found yourself in, and look, to varying degrees, different people have different sorts of spaces of opportunity during these kinds of pandemics. So not all of us are probably on equal footing in how we're experiencing it, but here's what holds us all in common. We're experiencing something and no one likes it. Like, no one likes it. And so here we are in a pandemic, and we're stepping into Ash Wednesday when traditionally we step into some sort of fast with Jesus. Fast from social media would be kind of a modern example. Fasting from food maybe once a week would be an ancient example, or longer. Some people will do that. But here's the thing. Haven't we been fasting long enough? Hasn't this year been a year of fasting from so much that makes us feel alive, that makes us feel connected to God, to others, even to the earth in some ways, although maybe you've gone out for a hike? Man, and even, especially probably, to the inward parts of yourself. You may feel down, depressed. You may feel flat out hopeless. What I want to suggest, and I'm not going to be long today, but I want to suggest what would it look like for us to say, okay, we don't have the instinct to, I need to give up something for Lent so that I can grow. We've given up a lot. But I do think for me, and I'm just sharing personal reflections here. I put these out in an article this week, and so you may have already seen this, but I really, this week, as I'm sitting in the tension of the whole pandemic situation in the season of Lent, what I'm going to give up is hopelessness. I want to give up hopelessness. And to be really honest with you, I come off as like a perky, happy, positive guy. But the truth of the matter is that in the darker spaces, in those spaces of loneliness and anxiety, it's hard. It's like I want to be hopeful, but when is this thing going to end? I want to be hopeful, but all of the stuff that I was already wrestling with, and maybe you relate to this, all the stuff that was already hard before the pandemic just feels like it was all put on hold, or maybe it's just a lot harder now. And we're stuck wondering, what does it even mean to follow Jesus during this time? Like, how do we can barely even touch people. And yet, I want to suggest that rather than saying we're not giving up anything, or I'm giving up something, what if we say, okay, let's take that in principle, but go a little deeper. What if we give up hopelessness? Now, the story of Jesus is interesting when we think about doing Lent during a pandemic. Jesus goes from a powerful moment in the Gospels. You can read about this in the early parts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It's a big story. But Jesus is baptized by John the Baptizer. And it's this really fascinating thing. In one of the accounts, the John the Baptist is like, dude, I don't want to do this. Like, you should baptize me. And Jesus is like, no, you got to understand, like, in order for me to do this thing where I am fully human, fully in this thing with people, I've got to step into those waters. I need to be baptized. And what happens as a result is just mind-blowing. A voice from the heavens, as God's Spirit is said to descend kind of like a dove on Jesus, a voice from the heavens speaks out. You are my son, whom I love. With you, I am well pleased. Or another translation says something to the effect of, you bring me happiness. I mean, think about that moment, right? The pre-desert moment, the pre-pandemic experience, right? Like think about that moment. Jesus in that moment has experienced the love of God in such a profound way. He is identified as the subject of God the Father's unrelenting, ridiculous love. I want to tell you something. The way that God saw God the Son, right? The way that God the Father saw Jesus in that moment, I believe is the way that God sees every single one of us. That every single one of us are image bearers. Every single one of us is invited to become someone who's in relationship with God in such a way that our identity is no longer shaped by shame, no longer shaped by stories that tell us we're not enough, we don't have enough. And Jesus shows us that you and I have an identity that is unshakably rooted in God's love for you and I. And there are going to be times when it doesn't quite feel that way. One of the things that happens, though, is Jesus has what I would consider the most beautiful moment of affirmation in his entire ministry. I mean, he has a couple of these, Mount of Transfiguration is another example. But after this moment, here's what goes down. Jesus is led by the Spirit into the desert. He goes to the desert for 40 days. Now, I'm not going to read the passage, you can go there, but the way the story is told, by the end of the story, there's 3 temptations, and the devil comes and tempts Jesus with power and influence, and Jesus is like, no, that's not my deal. I don't need what you have. I have something so much better than the kingdoms of this world. I have this other kingdom that I'm ushering in, this other way of life, this other community, this other society. And a society that's rooted in what I just experienced in those waters. Now, when I used to look at baptism, like this beautiful moment, and then the desert scenario, you know what I used to think? I used to think, here are 2 contrasts. Jesus goes from the most beautiful moment of his life up to that point, to the hardest moment of his life up to that point. That Jesus is weak, tired, and somehow musters up just enough courage, just enough of that identity to do the right thing in the end after that 40 days. I don't see it that way anymore. Let me tell you why. I was reading various things, and this idea came from Dallas Willard, actually, and he talks about how actually when Jesus is in the desert, Jesus is his strongest up to that point. Why? Well, instead of relying on food, as the old saying goes, instead of feasting on food, he's feasting on God. And so he has this experience of deep love, goes straight into the desert, and he has 40 days to sit with the ramifications of that love. And so Dallas Willard's point, and I think the gospel writer's point indeed, is this, that by the time the devil comes with the 3 big accusations, this is what happens. While Jesus is in the desert, Jesus confronts, not in a weakened state, but in the strongest state that confounds you and I. In the craziest kind of circumstance, Jesus is strong because his identity as God, the Father's beloved, has now taken root over those 40 days. He has been prayerful, led by the Spirit, and now, in the midst of the darkness, Jesus is stronger than ever. Ha! Consider that. You know, when I look at a world like ours right now, when I think of the pandemic, I don't feel stronger than ever, but I want to. I want to experience the reality that when Jesus went into the desert, he was filled with love and hope. Hope that he wasn't alone. Hope that he was going to be moving towards God's beautiful, reconciling future, not just for his life, but for the whole entire cosmos. So Jesus is full of love and hope, steps into the desert, soaks that in for 40 days, has this powerful moment of, hey devil, you don't got what you think you've got on me. And then he goes in and does a bunch of public ministry that blows our mind. During the pandemic, I don't know how possible it is to connect with the story of Jesus. I know we kind of like look at Jesus and say, well, he was perfect, he had it all together, so of course he could have that experience, but could I? Well, the truth of the matter is that Jesus was perfect, that Jesus did have it all together. But here's the thing, Jesus was a human being who shows us how to be human. And so you and I can step into space where we can experience God the Father's love, this overly abundant goodness. And we can go from that stage, that experience, that moment of goodness into a life where no matter who we are or what we are or where we are, look, here's the deal. You and I are going to face hard circumstances. If it's not a pandemic, it's something else. It's a relational problem. It's other diseases. It's losing jobs, losing things that were important to you. Suffering is a real deal. But here's the thing. What would it be like to step into pain, step into suffering, step into the desert, step into this remaining desert of pandemic that maybe we don't know how it's going to end or how it's going to unfold? But how would it be if you and I committed to saying, can we look to Jesus as the author of our identity? Can we look to Jesus' Father as the author of all that is good about us? Can we connect? Can we read the story of Jesus' baptism? Go there, go to those gospel stories, read them, and insert our own names and say, when God speaks this truth over Jesus, God is speaking this truth over my life because I've been baptized or I've been commissioned in the family of Jesus. I am someone who is all in on Jesus. I don't do it perfectly. I'm a mess at times. But when God sees me, God has that same radical upside down love for my life, for your life, just like he did his son 2,000 years ago when Jesus was baptized. I pray that as we step into this ongoing desert, as we also step into the desert that is Lent with Jesus, that where there is hopelessness, you will invite Jesus to show you that hope is still good and real. And by the way, the word hope only means something when things are broken, right? Like you don't hope when things are unbroken. Like when things are the way that they ought to be, hope has already been actualized. And here's the thing, you and me in our lives, we know that hope has not been actualized yet, but here's the deal. Moments of hope are being actualized. Moments in your journey. I mean, imagine a world where we didn't have access to God in a direct way through Jesus, right? Like that already is like hope-filled fulfillment. Like it's so good, even though it's hard. But it also means that it takes something. It takes understanding that hope is real if things are broken. When Jesus comes back to heal the world, to bring heaven to earth, to reconcile all things, all that cosmic language we have about the resurrection and all that stuff, when that's all said and done, and we're living in the renewed creation, that hope isn't something we're going to need. But we need it right now because things aren't right. But we want to trust that there is still hope for today. There's still hope for tomorrow. There are ways in which we can see the goodness and gratitude well up within us as we partner with Jesus in this very challenging season. And so on Ash Wednesday, maybe you don't need to give up anything except the struggle we all face with hopelessness. Can you start to excavate deep within yourself, within myself, and discover that under the layers, hope could be actually real? And so as we step in, I want to invite you to do something. I want to invite you to take ashes. And we're going to do something that the Christian church and various traditions has been doing for a long time. We're going to mark ourselves with the sign of the cross on our foreheads. And we're going to say, remember that you were dust, and to dust you shall return. Why do we do this? Because when we go into the desert, when things are broken, we realize that in a broken situation, life is temporal. Things aren't always going to work out how we want them to. And yet, that also motivates us because this day, in this moment, we have the God-given blessing of right now. That maybe tomorrow isn't guaranteed, but right now we can be hope-filled. Right now we can experience God's love and affirmation as the primary identifier of who we are in this world. Right now can be alive even if tomorrow might not be. Hope is here. Hope is now. So we take the ashes, and I want to invite you to do this. I suggest if you need to, you're like, oh, I didn't remember my ashes or whatever. If this video has a pause button when you're watching it, you can certainly press pause. And what I'm using actually is a different form of ash than we might use other times. Usually we use palm branches. I didn't have access to that. So I'm using very finely ground coffee. And it's, it's cooked. There's some ashiness to it. And so that's what I'm going to be doing. But as we do this together, as you put this mark on your forehead, know that you are being marked by the love and generosity of a God who sees you, who gives you love, who gives you hope. So let's do this together. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. I invite you to continue, if you have multiple household members right now, to continue in that. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Not because we need less hope, but because tomorrow isn't guaranteed. We don't know how the desert of the pandemic is going to work itself out. But what we do know is that we are loved and have just amazingly high value because God gives us that value as beloved ones. And once we've done that, we're going to move into a time of a brief communion. My friends, as we eat and drink, remember that Christ died for us and now feeds us, spiritually speaking, brings us together through these physical elements of bread and wine. Let's eat and drink, not just because it's something we do because the Bible kind of tells us to, but let's eat and drink and imagine that as we do so, we are taking in God's affirming, beautiful, shame-defying love that helps us step into the rest of our deserts in life with hope, empowered by a love so profound that it only could come from a good, loving, and beautiful Creator.